Aloha, I'm Bob Weber. I'd like to take a few minutes to look back at my early involvement with approval voting. It all started in the fall of 1970 when I was a graduate student at Cornell. Two liberal candidates faced a single conservative in the race to fill Bobby Kennedy's U.S. Senate seat. The liberals ended up splitting over 60% of the vote, and the conservative won with only minority support. The next day, thinking back over the result, I found myself wishing that I could have voted for both liberals. And then I thought, well, why not? I presented the idea to several colleagues, explaining it as allowing voters to vote for all the candidates of which they approved. The name approval voting stuck. One advantage of approval voting was that it could be immediately implemented. Since the late 1890s, lever machines could be set to allow votes for multiple candidates in a single race, and the then new vote-o-matic punch card systems were completely compatible with approval voting. To evaluate approval voting, it's necessary to represent voter preferences, predict voter behavior, and compare predicted election results with predictions made for other voting systems. Voter preferences clearly should be represented cardinally via the utilities a voter would derive from the election of any one of the candidates. This allows voters to feel more strongly about the results of some elections than about others, and it helps to clarify why a voter might sometimes cast one approval vote and at other times more than one. Voters will ultimately decide how to vote on the basis of their preferences and how they expect others to vote. I chose to begin with poll-less elections. A relevant example would be the election of an officer of a professional organization. Later, I'll return to a consideration of polls, but for now, I'll begin by assuming that every candidate is considered by the voters to be equally likely to be in close contention with any of the other candidates. Comparing approval voting with plurality rule, Borda's rule, or any other weighted voting system, it turns out that a voter will prefer to assign weights to the candidates in order to maximize the weighted sum of differences between individual candidate utilities and the average utility to the voter across all candidates. For approval voting, this translates to an intuitively pleasing rule. Vote for precisely those candidates who seem to you to be better than average. I ultimately chose to imagine societies where the voters have randomly generated preferences and wherein a voter doesn't know which of the many different roles defined by preferences he will be playing when the election takes place. In this case, he'd prefer the use of a system which maximizes expected utility of the elected candidate across all the different roles he might hold. Even in the two-candidate case, that socially best candidate might lose the election if a majority of the voters have opposing weak preferences. I evaluated the expected result of the election on an efficiency scale, starting at the bottom with pure random selection of a candidate, and peaking at the top with the unobtainable ideal of always electing the candidate of maximal aggregate utility across all voters. How far up in that range the actual expected utility to a voter of the elected candidate under a particular voting system was what I called the efficiency of that system. When there are only two candidates, the efficiency of any voting system is about 81%. This is the price we pay for not being able to measure a voter's overall intensity of preference. Under the plurality rule, efficiency drops as the number of candidates increases. Indeed, it drops asymptotically to 0%. On the other hand, Borda's rule performs well. Its efficiency increases as the number of candidates increases and rises asymptotically to 100%. What of approval voting? It beats Borda's rule slightly in the three-candidate case. For four or more candidates, only simulation estimates are available. However, it appears, rather disappointingly, that approval voting's efficiency lies somewhere between that of plurality rule and of Borda's rule. In both the 3 and 4 candidate cases, the best systems I've been able to find are hybrids, combining approval-like and Borda-like features. In summary, in a poll-less environment, there seems to be little reason to consider approval voting as a leading alternative to Borda's rule or various hybrid rules. The conclusion is straightforward. If there is a reason to advocate the use of approval voting over other voting systems, that reason must be found in the way that pre-election polls of the electorate's voting intentions can influence voter behavior. For example, under approval voting, even in the face of polls, voters never have an incentive to assign voting weights to the candidates in an order different from their true preferences. Under plurality voting, or Borda's rule, a non-monotonic assignment of weights is at times a voter's best strategy. Back around 1990, I gave a lunchtime seminar on approval voting at Northwestern. At the end, I illustrated the challenge of dealing with polls by using the 1970 U.S. Senate race in New York as an example. Imagine that approval voting is in use, and a poll reports that most of the liberal voters plan to double vote for the 2 liberal candidates, and the poll predicts that the conservative candidate will finish solidly in third. Hearing this, many supporters of either liberal candidate might change their voting plan and single vote only for their favorite candidate in the hope of vaulting him to victory. If enough liberal voters do this, the conservative might actually win, completely invalidating the poll's predictions. As soon as I was done, Roger came up and noted that a new poll, reporting the change in predicted outcome, would likely lead to the liberal supporters again changing their plans and returning to double voting. This would then invalidate the new poll's predictions. Roger expressed his feeling that there should be some type of equilibrium in which the polls could be correct. Not surprisingly, Roger was right. Indeed, the new equilibrium analysis, taking polls into account, revealed several ways in which approval voting is definitively superior to other voting systems such as plurality or Borda's rule. I'll leave further discussion of this to Roger.